My friendship with Ralph Ellison, indeed my getting to meet him and know him, is very much an American story. Goes back to 1977, 1978. Well, as Ellison, Invisible Man said, it goes way back beyond that, I suppose. I read Invisible Man when I was in college, actually the same age as I was the same age that Adam Bradley would be when he read Invisible Man, and when I showed him the boxes from the second novel, the boxes of endless computer printouts, and asked him if he would help me with this project in 1994. But I had wanted to write about Ellison's work for a long time, and finally in 1977 I wrote an essay on Ellison called "The Historical Frequencies of Ralph Waldo Ellison." And in this piece I tried to make the case that Ellison's essays, and at that time many of them, some of them weren't published at all, and many of the most compelling essays hadn't made it into Shadow and Act. And Ralph says it was rejected. He used to say these Society and Morality in a Novel, Tell It Like It Is, Baby, really unbelievably superb and original essays were rejected for inclusion in Shadow and Act, if you can believe it. And I tracked these down and tried to make the case that Invisible Man, his essays rather, not only provided a way to read Invisible Man, but also more broadly provided a way to read American literature as a continuing kind of engagement with the imperfect union of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the sacred documents of Abraham Lincoln, and also of the continuing struggle to perfect that union. So I wrote the essay, and I was pleased with it. And when it came out, we aren't always pleased with the things we write when they're published. Sometimes we get them and say, God, I should have spent more time, or maybe this one could have stayed in the box. But I was kind of pleased with it, and pleased enough to find Ellison's address and send him the piece, a little note. Dear Mr. Ellison, enclosed, please find. That was the kind of texture of the note, and rub my hands together. That's that. Well, it wasn't. That wasn't that. About 5 weeks later, I got back a two-page single-space letter from Ellison. He had read the piece, and he liked it very much, and he wanted to write me about it and talk about it. And it was as if it was a warm letter. It was also formal. Ralph and Fanny Ellison were warm and formal people. They knew what manners were all about. Manners finally had to do with both privacy and privacy and generosity. In any case, at the end of the letter, he said, "If you're ever in New York and have the time, Mrs. Ellison and I would be glad to see you." Well, I restrained myself. I didn't go to the airport that night. I had the impulse to do it. I didn't do it. But I was in New York several months later, and the Ellisons invited me to come over. And I wanted to tell a little bit about that meeting. It is so vivid in my mind. It was in May of '78, and I remember taking a cab up to Broadway and 150th really in Riverside Drive, and along the way passing a flower stand, and seeing these great burgeoning bunches of lilacs. I asked the driver to wait, got a bunch of lilacs, and that turned out to be an inspiration because the Ellisons loved lilacs. They had lilac bushes in their summer place in the Berkshires, and of course, Mrs. Ellison beat Ralph to the punch. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead ground. So they went right to the wasteland and so on more than I hadn't been thinking about that at all. In any case, they were warm and formal people. Mr. Callahan, Mr. Ellison, Mrs. Ellison, Mr. Callahan, Mr. Callahan. So Ralph ushered me into his study. And the study it was all kind of one big old room, kitchen connected to the study, connected to the kind of little living room that had a magnificent view of the Hudson. And there was a very elegant Italian marble table in the middle of the room, and there was a leather couch on either side of the table. And so Ralph pointed out the couch I was to sit, and he sat across, and we talked for 50 minutes or so. And you'd never have known that from this conversation that Ralph Ellison was a jazz man of the vernacular from Oklahoma, or that I was kind of a black Irishman, Moncay, from up the line in New Haven, Connecticut. We talked as if we were inhabitants of one of the later novels of Henry James. It was very portentous and Latinate and so on and so forth. And I glanced at my watch after a while. I was getting a little bit uncomfortable. And if I'm honest with you, why not be honest with you? Ralph? So at precisely 5 minutes to 5, this hand came down on the table. And he said, "Well, John, would you like a drink?" I don't know about why I needed a drink, I think, at that point. But I was kind of dumber than Invisible Man. Well, that's kind of a hard thing to be, and at least if you think about it, the Invisible Man of the early chapters. Because I said, "Why, yes, Mr. What?" "Sure, Ralph." And then he did what he did so often and so fetchingly and charmingly. He lapsed into this Oklahoma drawl, and he said, "That's better." And he disappeared into the kitchen and emerged with a bottle of bourbon, I think it was Jack Daniels, in a glass, and put it on his side of the table, and a bottle of Irish, I think it was Jameson's, in a glass, and put it on mine. And we were off. We were off and became very, very close friends. And I've said people over the years, long before Ralph passed away, when they would learn of my friendship with him, they said, "Well, what did he say about the Reinhardt character in Invisible Man, John? What did he say about the second novel?" And I, tried as best I could to explain to them that wasn't what our relationship was about. It was a friendship. And it was a friendship, and I think Adam perhaps will talk about this. Somehow Ralph has this pull on us all, whatever generation we're from. It was a very filial and paternal friendship. I wasn't there as a literary scholar at all. In any case, about 10 years later, after we'd become very close friends, I was up visiting the Ellisons in the Berkshires, and Ralph and I were taking a little walk and showing me his tractor. He loved gadgets, machines. And I said, "Ralph, I'd like to ask you something I've been wondering about since we met." And he said, "Why, yes." And I said, "I've always wondered about that damn Irish whiskey that you brought out when we met." And he said, "Well, what have you been wondering about, John?" And I said, "I've always wondered what the hell you would have done with the Irish whiskey if you hadn't liked me." And I thought that was pretty good. I needed to draw a good card, but I thought I had a pair of jacks to at least open the poker game. And Ralph looked at me. He had these piercing brown eyes that would light up with hazel sparks. And so he just looked at me and shook his head and said, with more than a hint of disappointment, I'm afraid, "For God's sake, John, I like Irish whiskey too." You could not get Ralph Ellison with any of that kind of identity politics nonsense. You couldn't do it with those categories. That's not where the man lived. He lived in another place. So you ask about Ralph Ellison, and that's what I would say, Mike. There's many other things to say as we go along tonight. But he was a special kind of human being. He was a special kind of man. I've never met his like. I haven't met his like before or since. He had the most defiant imagination of anybody I've ever met. And Mike spoke about this wonderful line of his, "The true American is also somehow black," from Ellison's Time magazine essay in 1970. And I think I should say this is, again, Ellison gave a whole new meaning to the term reversal. There's such a thing as an Ellisonian reversal. Time asked him to write an essay on what America would be like without blacks. So what does Ellison do? He absolutely turns it inside out, like so many of the jazz musicians, like Davis and the others do with Autumn Leaves, a sentimental tune, and they make it an incredibly gritty, harrowing piece of work. Well, Ralph would do that over and over and over again. He would take one's expectations, he would take various American cliches and turn them inside out and bring us to a new place. Okay.